Clara Mitchell always believed in treating everyone with respect, even in a workplace rife with favoritism and toxicity. When she chose to serve an overlooked customer with kindness, her actions clashed with the diner's toxic culture, leading to her sudden firing. Unbeknownst to her, that very customer would change her life forever. Clara Mitchell's journey is a testament to how doing the right thing, even when costly, can lead to unexpected rewards. Clara Mitchell had worked tirelessly at Maplewood Diner, a small but bustling eatery nestled in a quiet corner of Indianapolis, for 3 long years. The diner wasn't glamorous by any means. It was a modest, unassuming place, tucked between a hardware store and a laundromat, the kind of spot locals frequented for a warm meal and a familiar face. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee lingered constantly in the air, mingling with the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. Families came for Sunday breakfasts, truckers stopped for a hearty meal during long hauls, and regulars always found their way to their favorite booths. It wasn't much, but for Clara Mitchell, it was her livelihood. She worked double shifts, carried trays of steaming food with a practiced grace, and always greeted every customer with a genuine smile. But it wasn't easy. The hours were grueling, and the pay barely covered her modest rent and basic bills. Clara Mitchell shared a small one-bedroom apartment, and most of her paycheck went toward covering essentials, including some extra financial support for her younger brother, Ethan Mitchell. Ethan Mitchell was in his 2nd year of college, and although he didn't know it, Clara Mitchell often chipped in for his textbooks and groceries when their mom couldn't manage. She never told him, never wanted him to feel guilty. It was simply what she believed family did for each other. This sense of responsibility was why Clara Mitchell stuck it out at Maplewood Diner, despite the challenges. It wasn't just a job for her. It was a means to help her family and build some semblance of stability in her life. The diner itself, though, came with its own set of problems, most of which stemmed from the staff. Valerie Brooks, a senior waitress, had worked there longer than anyone and carried herself with an air of entitlement. She treated certain customers with warmth and charm, laughing at their jokes and making small talk, but others, those who didn't fit her idea of who deserved good service, were lucky to get a curt nod or their order taken without an eye roll. Jason Reed, a newer server, followed Valerie Brooks's lead. He avoided tables that looked like they wouldn't tip well, ignored customers he deemed unimportant, and often spent more time joking with coworkers than doing his job. The favoritism was blatant, and the energy in the diner would shift noticeably, depending on who walked through the door. Clara Mitchell hated this culture. She had grown up believing that everyone deserved kindness and respect, no Jason Reed or their circumstances or appearance. Yet at Maplewood Diner, kindness often felt like a liability. Her coworkers saw it as a weakness, a trait to be mocked or dismissed. Clara Mitchell had once made the mistake of commenting that a table had been waiting too long while Valerie Brooks lingered by the counter, scrolling through her phone. Valerie Brooks had turned to her with a sharp glare and said, "You don't get paid extra for playing the hero, Clara Mitchell." That moment had stuck with her, a reminder of how the diner operated. Either you fell in line with the unspoken rules, or you learned to keep quiet. And so Clara Mitchell learned. She kept her head down, did her job, and avoided calling out the behavior she found so frustrating. But that didn't mean she ignored it. She saw the way Valerie Brooks and Jason Reed treated customers like second-class citizens, rushing through their orders or ignoring them entirely. She noticed how regulars dressed in suits and ties received warm greetings and attentive service, while those in paint-stained work clothes barely got a glance. It wasn't just bad for business, it was wrong. Still, Clara Mitchell didn't know how to change it. What could she do? She wasn't in charge. She wasn't even particularly close to anyone on the staff. Speaking up had only made things worse before, so she focused on what she could control, her own actions. For 3 years, Clara Mitchell had managed to navigate this hostile environment, clinging to her principles even when it would have been easier to let them go. She took pride in her work, even if no one else seemed to notice. She memorized her regulars' orders before she learned their names, greeted new customers warmly, and did her best to create a small oasis of kindness in the midst of a toxic workplace. Yet, as much as Clara Mitchell tried to focus on her own corner of the diner, the weight of the larger culture sometimes felt unbearable. She had seen too many customers walk away frustrated or hurt. Too many coworkers smirk as they ignored someone who didn't meet their standards. It wasn't just the unfairness of it that got to her. It was the sense of powerlessness. The knowledge that no Jason reader how hard she worked or how much she cared. She couldn't change the system. Still, Clara Mitchell persevered. She took double shifts when they were available, partly because she needed the extra income, and partly because she preferred to stay busy. The less time she had to think about her coworkers' behavior, the better. She kept her interactions with Valerie Brooks and Jason Reed to a minimum, exchanging only the necessary pleasantries to avoid conflict. With Greg Thompson, the diner's manager, she maintained a professional distance. Greg Thompson wasn't exactly a bad manager. He just didn't seem to care. As long as the diner stayed afloat and the complaints didn't pile up too high, he was content to let things run as they always had. It was a system that worked for everyone but Clara Mitchell, who found herself carrying more than her share of the workload simply because she refused to sink to her coworkers' level. Through it all, Clara Mitchell kept her focus on her goals. She thought about Ethan Mitchell and how proud she was of him for pursuing a degree. She thought about their mom, who had worked 2 jobs for years to keep their family afloat. She thought about the customers who came back week after week, who smiled when they saw her and thanked her for remembering how they liked their coffee. Those small moments of connection were what kept her going, even on the hardest days. Clara Mitchell didn't think of herself as a hero or a martyr. She was just someone trying to do the right thing, in a place where the right thing often went unnoticed. What Clara Mitchell couldn't know, as she carried trays and refilled coffee cups, was that her kindness wasn't as invisible as she thought. It was this very quality, this refusal to treat people differently based on arbitrary judgments, that would set her apart when it Jason Reedered most. It was the reason a simple act of respect, serving a customer who'd been ignored by others, would set off a chain of events that would change her life and the diner forever. Clara Mitchell Hardy, the pot roast is a classic, but if you want my personal favorite, the grilled salmon's the way to go. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his expression. The salmon, huh? You sure about that? She grinned. Promise you won't regret it. Salmon it is, he said with a small smile, handing her the menu. As she jotted down the order and walked back to the kitchen, she could feel Valerie Brooks's sharp gaze burning into her back. She's wasting her time, Valerie Brooks muttered, loud enough for Clara Mitchell to hear. Jason Reed chuckled under his breath. Clara Mitchell clenched her jaw, but kept walking, placing the order without missing a beat. She wasn't about to let their pettiness ruin her night, or this man's experience. As she waited for the food to be prepared, Clara Mitchell noticed the quiet shift in the diner's atmosphere. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but Clara Mitchell felt it. Valerie Brooks's usual loud commentary had quieted, replaced by furtive whispers between her and Jason Reed. Even Greg Thompson, who rarely left his office unless absolutely necessary, peeked out for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before retreating back behind the door. Clara Mitchell's decision to treat this one customer with dignity had clearly disrupted the fragile balance of the diner's unspoken hierarchy, and everyone was on edge. When the food was ready, Clara Mitchell carried the plate to the man's table, placing it in front of him with the same care she gave every customer. Enjoy your meal, she said warmly. He looked up, meeting her eyes, and nodded. Thank you. It was a simple exchange, one she had had countless times before, but this time it felt different. It felt like a quiet act of defiance, a small but significant choice to do the right thing in a place where doing so often came at a cost. As the man ate, Clara Mitchell refilled his coffee without being asked, checking in on him periodically to make sure he had everything he needed. Each time, she could feel Valerie Brooks's and Jason Reed's eyes on her, their silent disapproval hanging in the air like a cloud. But Clara Mitchell didn't care. She wasn't doing this for them or even for herself. She was doing it because it was the right thing to do. When the man finished his meal, he left a generous tip on the table and nodded at Clara Mitchell on his way out. Have a good night, he said. You too, she replied, watching as he walked out into the night. Clara Mitchell didn't think much more about the interaction after he left. It was just another moment in a long shift, one of countless others she had experienced in her years at Maplewood Diner. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed an invisible line, one she couldn't uncross. The next morning, Clara Mitchell arrived at Maplewood Diner earlier than usual, the cool Indianapolis air biting at her cheeks as she stepped out of her car. She had barely slept the night before, her thoughts circling back to the tension from her coworkers after serving Leonard. It wasn't the first time she had noticed their disapproval, but this time something about it had felt different, heavier, sharper. As she slung her apron over her shoulder and walked toward the front door, she told herself she was overthinking. She had done her job plain and simple. What was there to worry about? Inside the diner was quieter than usual for the start of the morning shift. The familiar hum of the radio was missing, and the energy felt off. Clara Mitchell immediately noticed Valerie Brooks and Jason Reed standing near the counter, their heads close as they whispered to each other. They stopped abruptly when she walked in, both of them looking at her with a mix of smugness and something else she couldn't quite place. Jason Reed crossed his arms, leaning casually against the counter, while Valerie Brooks's lips curled into a sly smile. Clara Mitchell hesitated for a moment, her grip tightening on her apron. Something wasn't right. Before she could say anything, the sound of the office door creaking open drew her attention. Greg Thompson stepped out, holding a folder in his hand, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Donna and Jason Reed, then at Clara Mitchell, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Clara Mitchell," he said, his tone flat and emotionless. "Can I see you in my office?" Clara Mitchell's stomach dropped. Greg Thompson rarely spoke to anyone directly, unless there was a problem, and his voice now Ethan Mitchell cramped office at the back of the diner. The room was cluttered, as always, with stacks of paperwork and old coffee mugs scattered across the desk. Greg Thompson sat down, setting the folder in front of him, but not opening it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath, as if preparing himself for an unpleasant task. Clara Mitchell stood there, unsure of what to do, the knot in her stomach tightening with every passing second. "Clara Mitchell," he said finally, his voice still devoid of warmth, "we've decided to let you go." The words hit her like a slap. She blinked, certain she must have misheard him. "What?" she managed to say, her voice cracking slightly. Greg Thompson's expression didn't change. "It's not working out," he said simply, as though that explanation were enough. Clara Mitchell's heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. "Not working out," she repeated, a sharp, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "Greg Thompson, I've been here for 3 years. I've never missed a shift, never been late. What do you mean it's not working out?" Greg Thompson avoided her gaze, instead focusing on tapping the edge of the folder with his fingers. "It's a decision we've made," he said, his tone dismissive. "You can pick up your final paycheck next week." Clara Mitchell's throat tightened. "This is because of last night, isn't it?" she demanded. Greg Thompson didn't respond, but his silence said everything she needed to know. Heat rose to her face as frustration and anger bubbled up inside her. "So I get fired for doing my job?" she asked, her voice rising. Greg Thompson exhaled through his nose, clearly impatient with the conversation. "It's a decision we've made," he repeated, like a broken record. Realizing there was no point in arguing, Clara Mitchell took a deep breath and untied her apron, setting it on the chair in front of her. She turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back at Greg Thompson. "You know this isn't right," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Greg Thompson didn't flinch. Clara Mitchell shook her head and walked out. As she stepped back into the dining area, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. Valerie Brooks was leaning against the counter, her smirk practically glowing with satisfaction. Jason Reed pretended to be busy wiping down a table, but couldn't hide the smug glint in his eyes. They had been waiting for this moment, she realized. They had wanted her gone, and had probably been whispering about it long before she even showed up that morning. Clara Mitchell wanted to scream at them, to demand to know why they cared so much about making her life miserable. But she didn't. She refused to give them the satisfaction. Lifting her chin, she walked past them without a word, pushing through the front doors into the crisp morning air. The cold hit her hard, But it wasn't enough to distract her from the thoughts racing through her mind. For the first time in 3 years, she had no job, no steady paycheck, and no backup plan. Can't tolerate disrespect, favoritism, and a complete disregard for the values I believe in. But I also saw you. Clara Mitchell blinked, caught off guard. Me, she repeated. Yes, Leonard said firmly. You were the only one who treated me with dignity and respect. The only one who took the time to do what's right. I noticed that immediately, Clara Mitchell, and it made all the difference. His voice held an undeniable conviction that made Clara Mitchell's chest tighten. For so long, she had felt invisible at Maplewood Diner, her efforts going unnoticed and unappreciated. To hear that someone, let alone the owner, had not only noticed but valued what she did, was overwhelming. Then why did you let them fire? Valued what she did, was overwhelming. Then why did you let them fire me? She asked, frustration creeping into her voice. If you saw all that, why didn't you step in? Leonard paused, and when he spoke again his tone was deliberate. Because I needed to see what they would do. I needed to know if this was just a few bad moments or if the toxic culture ran deeper. When Greg Thompson fired you this morning, he confirmed what I already suspected, and now I know exactly what needs to change. Clara Mitchell sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to respond. Leonard's words were beginning to make sense, but it still stung to think that her firing had been part of some test. So what happens now? She asked cautiously. That's why I'm calling, Leonard said. I've already terminated Greg Thompson's position. He's gone, effective immediately. But I need someone to step up and take over. Someone I can trust to turn this place around and lead it the way it should be led. He paused briefly before continuing. Clara Mitchell, I want you to come back to Maplewood Diner as the new manager. Her breath caught. Manager, she echoed, barely able to believe what she was hearing. You want me to manage the diner? Yes, Leonard said without hesitation. You've shown me that you understand what it means to treat people with fairness and respect, regardless of who they are. That's exactly what this place needs, and I believe you're the right person for the job. Clara Mitchell's mind raced. Less than an hour ago, she had walked out of Maplewood Diner feeling defeated, unsure of how she would pay her rent or help Ethan Mitchell with his groceries. And now Leonard Hayes, the owner of the diner, was offering her the position of manager. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream or maybe a movie. But as the weight of the moment sank in, doubt began to creep into her thoughts. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. I've never managed anything before. I don't even know where to start. Leonard's voice was steady and reassuring. You don't have to know everything right away, he said. What Jason readers is that you have the right values and the right instincts. The rest can be learned. You've already shown me that you have what it takes to create a positive environment, even in a toxic workplace. That's not something everyone can do, Clara Mitchell. Clara Mitchell stared out the windshield, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the phone. She thought about the years she had spent at the diner, the countless shifts where she had given her all despite the toxic culture around her. She thought about the customers who had smiled and thanked her for her kindness, the moments of connection that had made the long hours worth it. And she thought about Valerie Brooks, Jason Reed, and Greg Thompson. All of them had dismissed her, underestimated her, and now she had a chance to prove them wrong. What do you say? Leonard asked gently, his voice pulling her back to the present. Clara Mitchell took a deep breath, letting the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She thought about Ethan Mitchell, about the future she wanted for herself and her family. This wasn't just an opportunity to step into a new role. It was a chance to change everything. Finally, she exhaled and nodded, even though Leonard couldn't see her. Okay, she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. I'll do it. Leonard's voice held a note of satisfaction. Good. Come in tomorrow morning at 8. We'll start fresh. As the call ended, Clara Mitchell sat in her car for a long moment, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been tossed aside like she didn't Jason Reeder. Tomorrow she would walk back into Maplewood Diner, not as a waitress, but as the manager. And she wasn't just going back to fill a position, she was going back to change everything. With a deep breath, Clara Mitchell started her car, a spark of determination lighting inside her. This was her chance to finally make things right. Sitting in her car, Clara Mitchell gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white. Panic bubbled just Ethan Mitchell at the surface as she thought about her rent, her bills, and how she'd been helping Ethan Mitchell with his groceries. How was she supposed to handle all of that now? Her thoughts spiraled as she stared blankly through the windshield, tears threatening to spill. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, pulling her out of her daze. She ignored it at first, unwilling to face another problem she couldn't fix. But when it buzzed again, she glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. Frowning, she hesitated for a moment before picking up. "Hello," she said, her voice shaky. "Clara Mitchell." The deep voice on the other end was steady, calm, and familiar. "This is Leonard Hayes." Clara Mitchell's brow furrowed as recognition dawned. "I'm sorry, who?" she asked, her mind still foggy from the shock of being fired. "The man you served last night at Maplewood Diner," Leonard said. Her breath caught. She sat up straighter in the driver's seat, gripping the phone a little tighter. "Oh, yes, sir," she said. "How can I help you?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Leonard said, "I heard what happened this morning." Clara Mitchell's stomach twisted, embarrassment and frustration swirling together. Of course he had heard. News like this traveled fast in a place like Maplewood Diner. "Yeah, well," she said, forcing out a bitter laugh. "I guess I should have just ignored you like everyone else." Leonard's response stopped her cold. "That's exactly why I'm calling," he said, his voice calm but purposeful. Clara Mitchell frowned, her confusion growing. "I don't understand," she said. Another pause. Then Leonard's voice came through again, steady and deliberate. "I wasn't just there for dinner last night," he said. "I was there to see how my employees treat people." Clara Mitchell froze, her mind racing to process his words. "Your employees?" She echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I own Maplewood Diner," Leonard said simply. Clara Mitchell sat in stunned silence, her breath catching as the realization hit her. The man she had served with kindness, the one her coworkers had blatantly ignored, was the owner of the very place she had just been fired from. Clara Mitchell's grip on the phone tightened as Leonard's words sank in. He owned Maplewood Diner. The man her coworker had blatantly ignored was Leonard. Clara Mitchell's grip on the phone tightened as Leonard's words sank in. He owned Maplewood Diner. The man her coworkers had ignored and dismissed was not just another customer. He was the one who had the ultimate authority over the very diner where she had spent 3 years, working tirelessly. Her thoughts raced as she tried to process this revelation. "You own the diner?" She finally managed her voice incredulous. "Yes," Leonard said calmly. "And last night I came in unannounced to see how my business was being run. I've made it a habit to visit my restaurants this way. No formal inspections, no advance warnings. I want to know how things really are when no one's putting on a show for the boss." Clara Mitchell leaned back in her car seat, her head spinning. "And what did you find?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Leonard let out a soft sigh before replying. "I saw a culture that I." Slung across her shoulder, and her chin held high. She could feel their eyes on her, their unease growing with each step. Valerie Brooks was the first to break the silence. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp with incredulity. Clara Mitchell tilted her head, a small confident smile playing on her lips. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied evenly, setting her bag down on the counter. Valerie Brooks's smirk faltered, and before she could say anything else, the door to the office opened. Leonard Hayes walked out, his presence commanding and deliberate. His tailored coat and calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the tension in the room. He scanned the diner briefly, his eyes landing on Valerie Brooks, Jason Reed, and then Clara Mitchell. "Good morning," Leonard said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here to announce some changes." The air grew even thicker as Valerie Brooks's and Jason Reed's faces drained of color. Leonard turned to the rest of the staff, who had begun to gather near the kitchen, curious about what was happening. "Effective immediately," Leonard continued, "there will be new management at Maplewood Diner. Greg Thompson is no longer with us, and Clara Mitchell is stepping in as the new manager." The room erupted into murmurs, But Valerie Brooks and Jason Reed were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. "You can't be serious," Valerie Brooks spat, her voice trembling with disbelief. "She's just a waitress." Leonard's gaze hardened as he turned to her. "No, Valerie Brooks. She's the only person here who treated me, and every other customer, with the respect they deserve. That's the kind of leadership this diner needs, and if you don't like it, you're free to leave." Donna's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Jason Reed, on the other hand, wasn't as composed. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She doesn't know how to run a place like this." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "And yet, she already understands more about fairness and integrity than you ever will. If you can't handle working under someone like her, you're welcome to find a job elsewhere." The finality in his tone silenced any further arguments. Valerie Brooks glared at Clara Mitchell, her expression filled with resentment, but she didn't say another word. Jason Reed muttered something under his breath before turning away, his shoulders stiff with anger. Clara Mitchell took a deep breath, steadying herself as the reality of her new position settled in. Leonard gave her a nod of encouragement before stepping aside, signaling it was her time to speak. She faced the staff, many of whom still looked confused or skeptical. "I know this is a big change," she began, her voice firm but calm. "And I know not everyone here is going to be happy about it. But things are going to be different from now on. This diner is going to be a place where every customer is treated with respect and fairness, no exceptions. If you're willing to be part of that, I'm excited to work with you. If not—" She paused, glancing at Valerie Brooks and Jason Reed. "You know where the door is." The next morning, Clara Mitchell stood outside Maplewood Diner, the strap of her bag slung over her shoulder and her breath visible in the cold morning air. Less than 24 hours ago, she had walked out of this very building with nothing. No job, no paycheck, and no sense of direction. Now she was about to walk back in as the new manager, a role she never imagined she'd hold. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as she stood there, taking in the familiar sight of the modest diner. This wasn't just about a promotion. It was about proving to herself and to everyone inside that she could do this. Squaring her shoulders, she took a deep breath, gripped the door handle, and stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon greeted her as she entered, just like it always had. At first, no one seemed to notice her presence. Valerie Brooks was leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone, and Jason Reed was laughing with one of the busboys near the coffee station. But then Valerie Brooks glanced up and froze. Her expression shifted quickly from indifference to confusion, and then to something closer to disbelief. Jason Reed noticed her reaction and turned to see what had caught her attention. His jaw tightened when he saw Clara Mitchell. The room seemed to go quiet as the two of them exchanged a look, their smug confidence from the previous morning replaced with uncertainty. Clara Mitchell didn't rush to speak. Instead, she walked purposefully toward the counter, her bag. The next few weeks were anything but easy. As expected, Valerie Brooks and Jason Reed resisted the changes, their resentment simmering just Ethan Mitchell at the surface. Some of the staff, those who had grown comfortable in the old, toxic culture, quit outright, slamming doors and leaving without notice. Clara Mitchell didn't lose sleep over their departures. She was determined to rebuild the diner into a place she could be proud of, even if it meant starting with a smaller team. Slowly, but surely things began to shift. The younger staff, inspired by Clara Mitchell's example, started to follow her lead. The kitchen crew, who had always kept their heads down, began to speak up about what they needed to do their jobs better. Regular customers noticed the change, too, lingering longer to chat with Clara Mitchell and the newly energized staff. The tension that had once hung over the diner like a dark cloud began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. One afternoon, as Clara Mitchell was going over invoices in the back, Leonard walked in unannounced once again. "How's my investment doing?" he asked with a small smile. Clara Mitchell looked up from her paperwork, a light laugh escaping her lips. "We're doing just fine," she replied, motioning to the bustling diner beyond the office door. The energy in the room was unmistakable, staff moving with purpose, customers laughing and chatting, and the smell of fresh coffee and warm meals filling the air. Leonard nodded, his expression satisfied. "I knew you'd turn this place around," he said. Clara Mitchell leaned back in her chair, a smile spreading across her face. "I didn't think I could at first," she admitted. "But it turns out all it takes is a little integrity and a lot of hard work." As Leonard left and Clara Mitchell returned to her tasks, she took a moment to reflect on how far she had come. What had once been just a job had become something far greater, a chance to create change, to stand up for what was right, and to prove to herself and others that kindness and integrity could lead to real, lasting success. For the first time in a long time, Clara Mitchell felt not just respected but fulfilled, and as she watched the diner flourish under her leadership, she knew she had found her place.